Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethos Online. Again, this is a space where we can be, belong, and become the very best version of ourselves. So, wherever you're joining us again, we just want to say welcome. Welcome to the journey, right? Welcome to stepping into a responsible reading of the Bible. And so again, here at Ethos, what we do is we take hours and hours of study. We want to prep each word, phrase. We want to look at different interpretations from the Jewish people who wrote and created these stories, right? We want to look deeply at the audience, context, everything we can so we can really appreciate this thing called Torah, right? The stories, the poems, the warnings, all of it. That's what we do. And then we can interpret it any way we see fit that really fits with culture after we've done the hard work. So again, today, welcome wherever you're joining us. So as many of you have known, we've been stepping through the book of Genesis, right? Genesis, many times, again, the book many people will refer to as the book of origins, right? The historical book that tells us how Israel began. Again, not the point, right? The book was not a history book. It doesn't have specific literal dates. These dates are metaphorically deeper for something, right? They are often stories told in profoundly big fish story ways for a purpose. And so we remember the stories of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Torah were told during Babylonian captivity, or I should say compiled, right? 587 BC, they're all compiled so that Israel will not lose a sense of what it means to be an Israelite, right? When you are in the middle of captivity, when you are in the middle of the city, the great city of Babylon, most people and most tribes are assimilating. They're taking on the values, the traditions, the gods of Babylon. Israel says, we will not do that, right? We're going to hold fast to what it means to be an Israelite. And so to do that, we need our stories, right? We need our values. We need to do our rituals and our traditions. We need to hold on to that so that we can keep Judaism Jewish, right? So Torah is really a response to the fears of assimilation. That's the point of it. So whenever the scroll is brought out, there's celebration because they see themselves in the story, right? Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, all these different individuals, they see themselves in the story. They see Israel reflected back when they read about these characters, the conflicts, the victories, the losses, all of it. They see themselves in the story, right? So good. And so today we're going to delve into Genesis 26, 14 through 24. And so this is a really interesting section, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. There's a couple really heavy points I want to share, and you would only find these points if you really studied Judaism, right? So here we go. I'll read it first, and then we'll delve in verse by verse. So here we go. Verse 14 we'll start with. And he had, we're referring to Isaac here, right? And he had possessions of sheep and possessions of cattle and much production. And the Philistines envied him, and all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines stopped them up and filled them with earth, right? Dirt. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us. You have become much stronger than we." Verse 17. And Isaac went away from there, and he encamped in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there. And Isaac again dug the wells of water, which they had dug in the days of his father Abraham. And the Philistines had stopped them up after Abraham's death. And he gave them the names like the names that his father had given them. Verse 19. And Isaac's servants dug in the valley, and they found there a well of living waters. And the shepherds of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's shepherds, saying, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they had contended with him. And they dug another well, and they quarreled about it also. And he named it Sitnah. And then lastly, 22 through 24. And he moved away from there, and he dug another well. So again, he's dug many wells now, right? And they did not quarrel over it. So he named it Rehoboth. And he said, "From now on, the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land." And he went up from there to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him on that night and said, "I am the God of Abraham, your father. Fear not, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your seed for the sake of Abraham, my servant." Many of you are like, we've heard this before. Yes, we have. Right? Many of these stories, you're going to see repetitions, cycles. You're going to say, "I've heard this story told a little differently." Yes, right? Because it's really the same story. It's the story of Israel. Now, let's delve in, right? Let's go a little bit deeper. So look at this, verse 14, right from the get-go. I got a little tickle in my throat tonight. "And he had possessions of sheep, possessions of cattle, and much production. And the Philistines," watch this, "the Philistines envied him." I want you to look at these two pictures here in the slide. One of them, 70 AD, the Romans, they destroy the Jewish temple, right? And they massacre everyone that can't run to the hills is killed. And it's this really terrible, painful moment for Judaism, right? For the Israelites. The Romans had envied them. They were worried about these Jewish individuals who were beginning to gain power and authority and economy. And in their enviousness, right, it scared them. And so what did they do? They responded by pushing Israel down. And what you have later on, thousands of years later, 1943, Rome again. It's really fascinating to me because this happens over and over again to the Jewish people. What happens in 1943 in Rome? Well, Jewish individuals are being deported. They're sent to concentration camps. And again, why? Well, if we understand Israel's history, we remember this cycle's happened before, don't we? And it's very sad because they're defeated, right? The empire, the powers that be, they view these Jewish individuals as threatening because in the middle of pain, in the brokenness, in the middle of economic depression, somehow Israel has found a way to not just survive, but thrive. And so oftentimes you have beastly empire very frustrated with this, right? They will scapegoat Israel. And so Israel over and over again has been kind of the scapegoat. They found ways to thrive. And they would argue it's because Yahweh has promised them a place of living, a place of thriving, a kingdom reality. And so again, over and over again, Israel is viewed by empires as being very threatening. And so at the heart of every large empire, every beastly one, John the Revelator might call it, every beastly empire, there is a deep, deep fear of losing control. Yeah, there's this deep anxiety that they're going to lose power, right? Lose resources, lose control over the people. And so this is what we see through Egypt, Rome, Babylon, Assyria, right? Over and over again, these beastly empires, they are terrified of losing power. And so they tighten grip harder and harder and harder. And Israel is thriving here. They are gaining possession, sheep, production, and of course, their enemies are envious. And so Israel's thriving. The Philistines are anxious. They're nervous. And it's very interesting to me. It's very similar in this moment. You might see this picture, Moses, right, and his people. It's a very similar story. Again, these stories repeat. Israel begins to thrive. They are sent out of Egypt, right? And the Pharaoh, of course, what's he do? Well, we know, right? He goes after Israel after he sent them out. And so he leaves, but Israel finds a way into freedom. They find a way to freedom. And so verse 17, watch this. There in the valley of Gerar is where he leaves and he finds encampment. So notice the beauty here. I really like this. Isaac leaves and he begins building at the place of Gerar, right? And again, we talked about this last week. Gerar is the place, it's the place of the circle, right? It's the place of moving back, repeating. Gerar, the circle, moving back. And so notice this, he digs wells where once his father had wells, right? At one point, his father had wells and his enemies put dirt in them. And so what Isaac is going to do here is really beautiful. And if you study the ancient Hebrews and you take time to understand Judaism, there's something fascinating here. Isaac's going to attempt to create life where his father's was snuffed out from him. And so read this part with me here. 18, Isaac again dug the wells of water which they had dug in the days of his father Abraham. This idea of digging up your father's well was actually a really profound one for Israel. Notice what Yoram Renan has said. Really beautiful, really interesting. This is one of the great rabbinical voices of this day. So listen to what he says here. The wells that Abraham had discovered and dug were covered by the Philistines. The Talmud teaches that water is an allusion to the Torah itself. The digging of a well is a search to reveal and spread its well springs. By redigging Abraham's wells, Isaac uncovered what had been obscured, ensuring that the knowledge of God's oneness would keep flowing into the world. I think this is beautiful, right? Isaac here in this moment, the deeper beauty of this text is Isaac is going back to the source, right? He's going back to those beautiful pictures of what it meant to be an Israelite. It's almost like he's digging up these treasures from his father's past, and he's looking at the photo album. He's saying, "Oh, I didn't know that my father did this. I didn't know that my family was here." He's digging up all these jewels, which again, for them, it would be Torah, right? We're digging up all of these values that we kind of had lost as a people. I want you to think about that. If Israel had been in Babylon for as long as we think they had, more than likely, Israel has forgotten some things, right? Generation after generation, you begin to forget. You forget their recipes. You forget some words. You forget certain things. And so what's really fascinating here is Israel is dusting off some of the old stories. Israel is dusting off some of these old traditions and rituals. And they're beginning to see, these are so beautiful. What did we used to do with that unleavened bread again? Why'd we do it? Oh, it was to remember that sometimes we have to leave quickly the things that bring death. Oh, why did we put blood over the door? Oh, it's a reminder of life. It's a reminder of sacrifice. We should do those traditions again, right? This is Isaac uncovering these things, these beautiful traditions, these beautiful stories of what it meant to be a Hebrew. And so again, he digs up the knowledge of his father that was lost, and it is so, so good. I want to share with you something. I was spending time looking at these old pictures of my grandfather. And again, I've shared different stories of my grandfather. I'm so proud to be the grandson of Henry Werfel. The more I understand about him, the more I'm in awe of that story. The more I want to work harder and harder at whatever field I'm in. It's because of the stories of Henry. And so I saw this picture of my grandfather. He was holding his shotgun, his hunting shotgun, and he had two dogs next to him. And on the other hand, he had this pheasant that he was holding. And I asked my dad, did Grandpa hunt? Was he a hunter? He said, yeah, he didn't really do the deer thing or anything, but he did enjoy hunting pheasant. And he said hunting pheasant was one of the things Grandpa just loved. He loved his dogs, his hunting dogs. He had this special connection with them. And he also had this special connection to nature. And so Grandpa Henry, he would go out into the woods and he would walk with his dogs and he would look for these pheasants, and he loved pheasant. First off, he would talk about pheasants apparently. They're the most beautiful bird. He really did love this bird. And so he had a deep respect for nature. He didn't love that he had to sometimes go out and buy meat, and he didn't know where it came from. And so my grandfather, he had a deep respect for nature. He had a deep respect for the food that he ate and where it came from. And so for him, the hunting of a pheasant was a really spiritual thing. And so Grandpa, he'd go out with his dogs, and sometimes he'd walk for hours, and he would just enjoy the woods and the smell and the time with his dogs. And sometimes he'd get a couple pheasants. And these stories I remember hearing after I saw the picture, I thought, oh, it's so beautiful. Well, years later, right? I've kind of forgotten some of those stories. I forgot that he hunted. I knew it, but I hadn't really thought about it. Well, a couple weeks ago, actually, some friends of mine said, "Tony, you should go pheasant hunting with us." I've never actually hunted in my life, and so I went through the hunter ed course. I did all that stuff, and I went pheasant hunting. And as I'm walking into these woods, and the dogs are running around me, I had this moment where I realized I'm doing something Grandpa used to love. And I kind of opened my eyes to it, and I realized this really is pretty beautiful. It's calm. The dogs are running. I'm walking. I'm looking for the pheasant. I got a couple pheasant. I realized how beautiful the bird was. And then I also had this appreciation of where my food comes from. Not from some factory, right? I had a deep appreciation for the bird. I had to dress up myself, all of those things. In that moment, I could not have felt closer to my grandfather. It was a really cool experience. I felt connected to my grandfather. And in that moment, I realized I understand now why that was such a deep, meaningful thing for him to do. He connected to nature again. He had time to get out of his head and just appreciate nature. And in that moment, I felt the same thing. And I felt like at that moment, I was digging up a well too. And when I saw the well, experienced the taste of it, I thought, this is so good. This is what this action, if you are an Israelite and you're reading this, Abraham dug up his father's wells. That's the interpretation. That's the meaning that immediately would have come to you that we miss now in the 21st century, don't we? Yeah, it's a really beautiful concept, but we're not done with this section. So let me continue reading, and we'll kind of circle back to this idea. But let's read more of chapter 8, verse 18. Isaac dug again the wells of water which they had for Abraham. So again, uncovering the stories. And so notice this in verse 19. Isaac's servants dug in the valley, and they found there a well of living waters. I like this. When you've uncovered it, just like the story I shared with you, when you found it, it brings life. It brings meaning. There's something beautiful, powerful there, waiting at the surface for you to get a hold of once you do the hard work of uncovering it. And again, this is really what we're talking about Torah reading here, aren't we? You could read the Bible on a surface level, couldn't you? Yeah, you can read the stories and say, cute story, right? Oh, fascinating, right? But if you dig deeper, because that's what the ancients did with Torah. When you dig deeper, when you ask deeper questions of the mystery of the divine, when you ask deeper questions of the stories, of the narratives that you've been brought up, when you take time to smell, taste, see the beauty of the walk with those dogs looking for the pheasant, when you open your eyes to it, it opens up. It becomes a living thing. And this is why they referred to Torah as a living, breathing story, right? It's living, it's life before them. That's the deeper idea of the well. For them, it was Torah. It was their story. It was their identity. We'll keep going. Verse 20. And the shepherds of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's shepherds, saying, the water is ours. So he named the well Isaac because they had contended with him. Now, we understand this too, right? When you've opened up the well, when you've experienced something good, There are often conflicts that will occur. And so again, empire sees it, they want it, they desire the power, they desire the promise. Yeah, and we've even heard the story before, haven't we? Right? In many different ways, between different brothers, right? Yeah. We see Cain and Abel, right? They quarrel over the land, they quarrel over the sacrifice, they quarrel over the altar, they quarrel over the blessing. That was the deeper picture. They quarrel over the blessing. And so whenever there's beauty, whenever there's life, there's also going to be conflict. There's going to be those that will attempt to extort it, right? They will attempt to brutalize it. They'll attempt to manufacture it. But the promise is still there. But here's what Isaac chooses to do. When empire strikes, right? When the promise is being taken from him, look what Isaac does here. It says he dug another well and they quarrel about it. So he names it Sitnah. So he goes, he digs up another piece of what it means to be Israel. He keeps digging. He doesn't just stop there. He keeps digging. He doesn't stop. And so he digs up a place called hostility. That's what Sitnah means. He keeps digging. He keeps moving. He keeps shifting. He doesn't stop, but he doesn't stay in the place where there's pain, where there's brokenness. He keeps moving on because at some point he's finally going to rest in the promise. Do you hate your job? This picture here of this woman with her face on the copy machine, I think some of us really connect with this, don't we? Do you hate your job? Is the relationship you're in literally killing you? Do you hate the space that your head seems to sit in often, right? Well, here's the story, right? It's a reminder here. Isaac says, I'm not just going to stay here in Sitnah. I dug up the well. I found something interesting, but then along came conflict. Someone chose to ruin it a bit, right? Someone chose to hurt me in that moment. I don't have to stay here. I can choose to move on. I can choose to go to other wells. So Israel, watch this. It's so brilliant. Israel, you dug up this piece. And when you dug up this piece, there was a lot of beauty there, but there was also some stuff that was kind of, we don't have to do that anymore. Let's go on to the next well. What does the next well have for us to uncover? Oh, there's a lot of beauty there, but look at that. There's some cycles that we kept falling into that maybe we don't want to do anymore. Let's go to the next well. Do you see it? Sometimes in our lives, when something doesn't work, you can choose to step away. You always have the choice. You can choose to step away. If that church congregation is not working for you, try another. If that community doesn't fit with you, learn from it, try another, right? Continue moving forward. You can choose. It's really pretty beautiful. Israel, take the good, move on. Take the good, learn from it, learn from the bad, move on to the next well, right? Dig up the next well. And so it continues. He moved away from there. He dug up another well. They did not quarrel over it. Notice that. He dug up this well. They did not quarrel over it. He said, for now the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land. So again, he exits, right? There's an exodus from the place of hostility. He digs another. He finds peace, right? He walks away from the thing that's broken. He digs again. So good, right? And then notice this. He moved away from there, dug another well. They did not quarrel over it. He named it Rehoboth, right? The place of wide blessings. That's what the word in the Hebrew means. It's broad, it's full. So in order to find fulfilling well, right, fulfilling life, life-giving water, he had to begin looking for new space after leaving captivity. This is the message of Israel, right? Israel's seen themselves in the story. So here's the message. Remember your past, but build a new future. Remember the past, build a new future, dig a new well. So good. For now, the Lord has made room for us. We will be fruitful in the land. Again, It's repeating the Abrahamic promise, isn't it? You will be fruitful and multiply. And he went up from there to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him on that night and said, I am the God of Abraham, right? Your father. Fear not, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your seed for the sake of Abraham, my servant. And when we do, right? When Israel does, when Isaac does, you are reminded there that there's nothing to fear. Yahweh walks with us. So good, right? So good. And it actually reminds me of his story. It reminds me of another story from Jesus. It's one of my favorites, and I think it's often kind of skipped over. But this story is really just the story of Isaac. It's really the story of Isaac experiencing this again and God opening up the path to a new well. So follow me on this one. Here in John 4, 5 through 13, there's a really interesting story, beautiful one. Listen to it. I'll read some of it, not all of it. John 4, verse 5. So he came to a town of Samaria. So again, Samaritans were like the stepchildren of Israel, right? They were the family members who live way out there. We don't talk to them except for Thanksgiving, right? This is what the Samaritans were for them. The Samaritan called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given his son Joseph, right? Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, again, we know the story, women would have drawn in the early morning. So if she's coming at noon, there's a bit of shame, right? There's a shame element to this well, this story, right? Jesus is there, and think about the brilliance of this. Jesus is not going to dig up the well. He's going to dig up some things for the woman, right? He's going to dig up her story. He's going to remind her of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then he's going to ask her, which well do you want to draw from? Yeah, so good, right? The Samaritan woman came to draw well. Jesus said, will you give me a drink? His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, you are a Jew, I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Sir, the woman said, you have nothing to draw with, the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Right? The well's too deep. It's too covered, right? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank of it from himself, and did also his sons and his livestock? This is going way back, right? Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. Right? Whoever drinks the water I will give them will never thirst again. Isaac, if you keep drawing from your father's well, you're going to repeat the same story. If you keep drawing from the same thing, if you keep moving to the same circles, you're just going to repeat them. Isaac, you have to draw from a new well. Samaritan woman, you have to drink from a different well. You keep drinking from the same well, repeating the same mistakes, repeating the same story, repeating the same cycle. You need to draw from a different well. Israel, you keep drawing from the same well. It's time for a new well. This is what Jesus is saying. And I want you to notice something really brilliant. At the very end of the story, it concludes with a phrase that I think is just dynamite. It's essentially, again, the story of Isaac, but I think it's even more bold. And here's how it ends. He says, drink from this water. And the woman says, I get it. He reminds the woman, you keep living in these same patterns that are bringing you brokenness. Stop. Draw from a different well. And when she gets it, she's like, oh, I see what you're saying. It's not about the literal water, is it? Jesus is like, no. She takes off into the city to tell her friends. And there's this one line here that I think is just enormous. It's gigantic. It's a beautiful moment. It's this. It says, then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town. She was there to draw water. That was the whole point. Except now she realizes she doesn't need this well water anymore. She's found something deeper, something more fulfilling, something that is going to fulfill the promise Jesus has just given her. You want eternal water. You want water that's going to give you lasting fulfillment. You want the kingdom reality kind of water. You want the kind of life that is lived that brings purpose and value. If you want that kind of life, Jesus says, will give it to you. Follow me. That's it. Jesus promises her, follow me, follow these teachings, learn to love your enemies, learn to thrive in the middle of captivity, learn to forgive those who are so hard to forgive, learn to live that kind of life. You start drawing from deeper waters, deeper wells, and your life becomes deeper, fuller, richer. That's the beauty of the story of Isaac here. I hope you enjoyed that. It is heavy, but it's so good. Am I right? And again, just one section of this piece here and so much to unravel. So I asked myself here, what can we do to bring it home, right? What do you do to apply it for today? Well, how do we learn from our past? And I know that this is kind of a theme we've discussed, but in this connection with Isaac and the story of the Samaritan woman, I think there's some interesting concepts to kind of tease out, and just a couple I wanted to share. But number one is, if I want to learn from my past, one of the things I can do is I can learn to first replay it. And this is really the digging up. So replaying a situation is it's different than reflecting on it. So try walking back through the situation like you're reliving it. And so this is how Israel, they would retell a story over and over and over again, because they understood if you replay it enough, you might finally hear the story, right? If you replay it enough, you might finally see your part in it. And so we replay the event until we finally see it. Some of us, we have a story. Some of us we've been victims. And so sometimes we have to tell the story until we finally hear it. And when we hear it, then and only then can we step into the place where we can find release from it. Number two, right? Release from it. And again, there are some things in your past that you will regret, right? You feel guilty about, or you wish you've done it differently. But the fact is, however badly you feel, right? However desperately you wish you could change it, it is the past. It's the past. And so the page is turned, right? This may mean you have to learn to forgive others and yourself. You learn to find release from it. And then number three, after you're able to do that, you can then begin reframing it. And I love this word, reframe. Right? You're taking this old picture, you're putting a new frame on it. It's a really beautiful idea. Reframing the past is something we can do with perspective that comes from replaying, releasing it. And so we begin finding the beauty in it, right? We begin learning the lessons from it. We begin to understand our part. We can appreciate certain things. We can learn from it. And then, only then, after we've done those steps, the most beautiful part happens next. And this is where I've begun to feel that like I'm beginning to walk in this place for me personally. After I've done those three steps, I can begin using it. I can begin sharing the lessons I've learned. You don't talk about your pain while you're in the middle of pain to make a lesson to teach someone, right? You're not a teacher until you've walked through those steps. And once you've walked through them, then you can teach others about the thing you've experienced because you've learned something from it. You have something to share, right? Yeah. And so in this moment, you use it, you share it, and you do this in order to help others grow. Not to build a mob, to go after a certain person or whatever because they victimize you. No. After you've moved through those health steps, then you use it to help others grow. So good. Everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this. As always, please consider going to ethos-church.org/donate. We are a tax-deductible donation, and we work from what we've been given. And so the time we have, the amount of energy we're able to put into it, the video work, all of it, it all happens because of your donations. And so thank you for making that possible. As always, consider joining us live through Ethos Living Rooms and subscribe, share these videos. We would like to see the YouTube channel grow as much as our other elements have too. And so share, help this thing grow. We're so glad you've joined us today. Everyone, have a great day, and we'll see you next week.